with all the interest on revolvers, I get regular reader mail, and people ask me questions about, you know, how do I take apart my revolver? Should I take apart my revolver? I would like to replace the grips. I would like to replace the sights. What we're going to do today is cover how to take apart a K-frame Smith & Wesson. And what I would recommend doing is that as you take it apart, maybe take some phone pictures or even a little video to remind you how it goes back together. The other really important thing is get yourself a couple of take-apart books. Here's a couple. This is a Smith & Wesson shop manual that's specifically made for these model Smith & Wessons. This book happens to be by Gun Digest by our own J.B. Wood, who you read his articles in Handgunner all the time. Jay has done a series of comprehensive takedown, detail stripping revolvers down to the last pin. This will save you. Trust me. You'll have your gun apart. Jay will help you get it back together. Well, let's get to work and take apart a revolver. All right, well, let's take a look at what we've got here. A couple things you can remember is when you're an old guy like me, you got to put your glasses on. We'll make sure that the gun's clear. Ta-da, empty gun. A visor like this can also be really, really handy, and even if you're not old, you'll be surprised how useful they can be. So a couple things. You'll want a little non-marring mallet like this. Frankly, I've actually also used the handle of a screwdriver. If you don't have like a Brownell's magnet tip screwdriver set like this, then you have to get one, because that way you can make sure that you're using screwdriver tips that actually fit. You can't use commercial buy them at Home Depot screwdrivers, because these gunsmithing screwdrivers are ground specifically for guns. You can also get fixed blade ones like this, and I actually have ground this to fit screws specifically, you know, for needs through the years. So okay, a little bit of lube, because we'll have the gun apart, so we might as well lube it up, and a rag. And then I made this tool, which I'll show you what it's for a little bit later on. So, okay, let's get to work here. All right, first thing we do, remember we have cleared the gun, is take the grips off. And this is a World War II era Smith & Wesson Victory model. Now sometimes, there you go, you may have to fuss with the grips a little bit to get them off, especially on an older gun. And in this situation where you don't want to pry here with a screwdriver or something, so just kind of poke them through. Ta-da! Grips are off. So now what we're going to do here, and this is an early gun, a 5-screw gun. The same thing applies if it's a 4-screw gun, which is they got rid of that one and there were only these 4 screws. And then later on they got rid of this screw, which is a side plate screw, and then they became 3-screw guns. And so at this point, we know it's unloaded. We'll just simply take these screws out. Now I do recommend when we take them out that you lay them in an order, because this screw can be shortened that specifically fits, it holds the cylinder yoke in. And so since these screws have been living in these holes for so long, I like to put them back in the same holes. Now this upper side plate screw is very much different, so it can only go in there. So what you want to do here is when you take the side plate screws out is make sure that you put enough pressure, down pressure, that the screwdriver doesn't slip out. In this situation, this old gun has been apart before, and these screws are kind of scored up on the top, and so I had to go to a slightly narrower, slightly smaller screwdriver blade in order to get it in. And remember, as I said earlier, we'll put these out in a row here. Now, you know, we talked a little bit about detail stripping your gun. Do I recommend you do this all the time? Absolutely not. If you take your gun apart like this all the time, all you're going to do is wear it out. The more you do this, the harder it can be on the gun, and every time you do, you're going to risk scratching the side plate, you're going to risk breaking a spring, losing a screw. So this is something, if you shoot your gun a lot, maybe once a year, if something breaks and you think you know what you're doing, and look at some of our other basic gunsmithing videos, then you might want to go ahead and at least look and see if there's something obvious. Okay, we have these side plate screws off. You don't have to take this screw off yet. Now, this is where you need a little hammer. Where people make the mistake is they go in and they try to pry the side plate off. Well, that's how you get dinged up side plates and stuff like that. In actuality, it's really simple. What you want to do is tap, just like this, and what it will do is it'll lift that side plate out. Let's see, do you see it coming out? Oh, there it is. Yeah, no, I was a little overzealous there and it flicked out. But you could see the vibration just vibrates it right out. And now you have no pry marks and you haven't messed anything up. Since we took the this side plate screw out, that also holds the cylinder in. So if we push the cylinder latch, watch this, Ta-da! Comes right out. So now we're going to go unscrew the mainspring screw here. Let's see. Now watch too, because there's a lot of times you'll pick up an old gun like this and you'll realize this screw is loose. The reason for that is a lot of people they shouldn't be doing it this way. They think if they unscrew the tension screw, what it does is it lowers the tension on the mainspring and gives them a lighter trigger pull. The problem with that is it's a very unreliable way to decrease your action power. What it does is usually it just leads to misfires. So watch that. If you buy a gun and you think, oh, it's misfiring, it's the first thing I would do is I would check that tension screw. It should be screwed all the way in. Okay, so there's the mainspring. That was easy. Now things get a little more complicated, okay? So pay attention. What we've got to do here is if we try to pull the trigger, the hammer will hit the cylinder release back here. See right there? So normally when the cylinder's in, the cylinder release is pressed back, which pushes this little cam out of the way. So what we need to do here is we need to push the cylinder release back and then just carefully squeeze the trigger like that all the way back, and then you kind of can manipulate the hammer and it comes out. So ta-da, hammer comes out. Now let it go forward. At this point, this is the hammer return or the trigger return spring. Now watch. I pull the trigger. What it's doing is compressing a spring right there. You see that? So now when you let the trigger go after the hammer trips, what it does is it pushes against the trigger with that little lever right down in here, and that's what returns the trigger. Now something else you'll see is people will take this spring and shorten it. And the reason they shorten it is so there's not as much power required to pull the hammer back. But again, what happens though, if that spring's too light, is the trigger returns sluggishly or sometimes not at all. So the people from Smith & Wesson are pretty smart, and they know, how strong these springs need to be. So what you're going to do here is catch a corner of that and then just pry it up, and then you'll see, watch out, because this spring's right here, and it'll go flying across the room. And then you'll do they call it the gunsmith prayer, and that's where you're down on your hands and knees on the garage floor at 3 o'clock in the morning looking for your spring. Okay, so we have the trigger return spring and slider out. Now what you need to do is ease the hand out, and then in this old 5-screw model, you kind of pull the trigger back, and then the trigger will just come out just like that. Now you'll have this little lever that goes into the plunger like that, right? Back and forth. And then you have to be careful here because the hand is just in a pin here and it'll just pull out. And if you pull it out, there's a spring down inside here that maintains pressure on it. And I promise you, unless you've really been paying attention, you're not going to understand how that goes back together. So also I want to say, keep in mind, this is actually a very early revolver. So a lot of the action parts will look different and be slightly different on different models. But if you have a J frame, a K frame, an N frame, even an L frame, they'll be very similar. So if you do these same basic steps and pay attention to what you're doing, then you can get your gun apart. So now the final thing we would do here in this 5-screw gun is we'll take this screw out, which maintains a plunger and a spring. Now this is a little more delicate. What you'll need to do here, and sometimes I use another tool, like a pair of tweezers or something. You're going to push the bolt through the window down like that, and then just sort of work it out. Now remember, can you see that? Now remember, there's going to be a spring and a plunger right in there, right there. So just make sure that doesn't come flying out or you lose it. So at this point you could really clean your gun really thoroughly. You have to be careful here if you want to unscrew the ejector rod here, is that on these old Smith & Wessons they're reverse threaded. So if you want to unscrew it, you would actually turn it to the right as if you're righty-tighty, So, but in this case it's righty, unscrew it. Now, I don't recommend doing that unless you have somebody show you, because if you use pliers, all you're going to do is bugger this up. And even if you wrap it with leather or a piece of lead or something, chances are pretty good you're going to bugger it up. So I would just leave it at this point here, and you can clean it just fine. Okay, now we have to reassemble it. And I always have to laugh because in a lot of books they always say reassembly in reverse order. Well, the only problem is there is a couple of tips here. The one is that don't forget you've got that plunger there. So when you go to reinsert the bolt here, you're going to have to work that plunger out of the way to get it in. And I just will use a prick punch or something just to push it in and get it out of the way for it to seat. So the other thing is when you put this slider and hammer return or trigger return spring back in, you're going to be at a spot here in this location, and what you need to do then is, that's why I use this special tool. So, you can actually buy a gunsmithing tool that does this, and what this does, I made this, and you could make it out of just a piece of round steel or something, and it has a slot, but what it does is it compresses that spring like that, and as it compresses the spring, it allows you to push it down with this cutout sliding down over that. But in actuality, you can actually do it with a screwdriver. Just push the spring past that pin and slip it down. Keep your thumb over the end of it though, because it'll go flying off otherwise. As you reassemble it, as you go to put the hammer back on, remember you have to pull the latch back as it slides back on, and it'll match and mesh with the double action sear, and then pretty soon that's all back together. Just watch the video again and you'll remember how the the mainspring goes back on. These actually clutch that little stirrup just like that as it goes back on. And then when you put the side plate back on, you don't want to pound on it, you don't want to do anything like that. You can just sort of press fit it down, and then the final last bit of it is done by simply tightening down the screws. And so there you go. Don't forget, get your hammer, and that's how you can take the side plate off. So if you have an old beat up gun, it'd be good to practice on that. Or borrow your buddy's gun. Well, that was kind of quick and down and dirty, and if you don't feel confident doing this, then don't do this. However, I think if you have some decent tool skills and you're a real gun guy or girl or lady, I think this is something you can manage. Just remember, go slow, don't force anything, use the right tools, make sure you clear the gun before you do this. And if you get stuck, stop. Get JB's book. There's a wealth of information on the internet. And hey, you know what? If you have questions, feel free to put them in the comments, and I promise we'll respond. Thanks for tuning in.